Hello people, good to see you again. This is Michael from Make It WordPress, and today we're going to do something very interesting. It will be technical, it will be programming, and you need some experience for it, but we're going to make reusable components in WordPress using PHP. Wow, that sounded fun. Well, I will explain you later what it is, so let's go over it. What we are going to do is to build components, reusable components in PHP, and I will explain a very smart way to do this, and which will make it very easy to create new components. A component is anything visually in the front end, in your front end of WordPress, such as a button, a grid of posts, a title, could be anything you can think of. I will explain a way how you can create components in PHP and also easily attach them to existing content. So to go along with this tutorial, you need to have local installed or any other tool that you can use to install WordPress locally on your computer. Or you can also use of course, an online development environment, but this is a very easy way to have WordPress run locally on your computer. I really like this tool, it's great. You also need Node.js. You can download the latest version from nodejs.org, and at last I'm using Visual Studio Code to write all my code in. You're free to use another editor, but I think this is a great editor and it's basically becoming the standard for many developers out there. So, if you're ready for it, let's get started with the real code. So I've opened up my editor and I already created a folder with all the existing files and folders in it. I will go through each of these files one by one, so you don't need to create this first. One thing you need to do is that in your plugins folder, in the location you're developing, so in WP Content Plugins, you need to make a new folder, and in this case it's named like this. You can give it any other name you like. This is the example we're using. By the way, I will also upload all the code that I'm using for this project on GitHub, so you can also look it up later. So the first thing we're going to do is tell WordPress that this is a plugin, and for that we need to actually add a couple of predefined settings which WordPress recognizes, which is plugin name in these comments. Let's pick WP component example, and well, you can add a description if you like, and add an author, a license, a version. In this case, I will add a version, and I believe this already will be enough. So if I switch over to my WordPress development environment and then look in the list of my plugins, it will be shown there, and there we are, WP component example. These are just the strings we added in our comments, and WordPress already recognizes our plugin. So let's go ahead and activate it, so the code will be also loaded by WordPress, and then move back to our editor. All right. So I will teach you about using classes, object-oriented programming, and also a way to separate your PHP code into a code that describes getting data and defining the logic. And because we're using classes, we can use autoloading, which is a very nice functionality that basically says that every time you call a class, when you're using object-oriented programming, you are calling a class, it is going to be loaded automatically. But to do that properly, we still need to write some code, and in PHP there is this function which is called SPL autoload register, and we can use that function to register any autoload calls. And for that we need to pass a function to this function as an argument, and this function will get a class name, actually the class name of the actual called class, in as an argument. In this case, we only want to apply the autoload function to any of the classes called by a plugin, and we'll be giving them, all the classes will be giving them a certain namespace to say that they belong to this plugin. I'll explain you that later, but for now you can add this code. I will just use this as the namespace for the plugin. You can pick any namespace you like to filter out any classes that are not part of this plugin. Well, what this function actually does is that every time a class is called, for example, a class is called by new, and then this is the way how a class is called. It will look up the class called in class name, and then it will look up in the code if it can actually find the file that belongs to this class. The great thing is that we don't need to manually require all the classes that are in our folder and in our plugin, and we can just automatically create new components, new classes, and if you call them, they will be automatically loaded. So that's why we're doing autoloading, and I will continue writing some of the code now. Let's just reformat how our called class look like by replacing some of the strings we find into the called class. In this case, we are going to replace any backward facing slashes and also our root namespace, which in this case is my PHP component. Let's call it my PHP components. And then we are going to replace any backward slashes by forward slashes and our namespace by nothing. And obviously we will execute this function on the class name that was passed in this function. Let's create a variable for our file string. And our file string will be similar to this. With their name file, we output the actually directory of the current file we're looking at. And in this case, the current file is wp php components example.php. And as you can see, I set up a folder structure already where we have source. Source is actually the place where all code is placed. All code is placed that is not public. So most of the PHP code and also some of these assets, which I'll explain later. In source are placed classes. In classes I have a folder components with already a component, an example component. There's also the plugin, which is the main class for our plugin. And there's also a folder called templates in which our example component will be. So we need to be looking into this source folder actually, and then into the classes folder to load our called class. And well, we can just output our called class in here and then the file extension, and this should be the correct path to the file. Now that we have correctly formatted our class file, I can now do an if check to make sure the file exists. Check the class file, and then if it exists, require once. And there we are, we have Autoloading Setup. All right, so that now that we finished our autoloading, we need to boot our plugin. And because we're building a plugin, it would be good to use a certain hook, WordPress, so that the code is executed at the current time. So we'll be using the plugins loaded hook, and this ensures our plugin has access to the correct functions and such in WordPress. What I also will be doing is defining a path that we can use later in our plugin. And the current file. So what this does, it saves the current path we're in, so the root of this plugin, to the constant empty path, and you can use this constant in any class or code in this plugin. Then let's boot our plugin, and we're going to write the code for the plugin afterwards. So to boot our plugin, we need to call actually, we need to use the namespace we already defined, which in this case is my PHP components. And then we're going to call the plugin class. And for this, I'm going to use an interesting pattern. I'll explain later, but I will call it like this. Plugin is my WP component / /plugin and then instance. So there we are. We finished the basic file of our plugin. If we're now going to load it, it will give a fatal error, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it will give a fatal error, and that makes perfect sense because it cannot find the plugin class. So let's look why that is happening. So in our plugin file, in classes, we're going to write our plugin class actually. And we are going to do that by starting with the PHP opening tag. Then we'll write some comment what it does. And then we need to define our namespace. So PHP knows what namespace we're programming in and also what folders to look at. And this should be actually similar as the namespace we defined in here. So this is like the root namespace of this plugin. When we will create a component later, you will see how that actually functions. And then we will do a security check. This will make sure that any hacker or someone who doesn't have the best interest for you cannot access this file correctly. And then we can write our plugin. In this case, we will call the class plugin. And we are going to use the singleton pattern. And this is a specific design pattern, which is used in many programming languages. And this pattern only allows a class to be instantiated once. So it cannot be instantiated multiple times. And it's very useful for for a class that, for example, is booting a plugin, for a class that's connecting to a database, and so forth. That's the pattern we're going to use. For that, we need to have a property. I will call the property instance, and at first it will be null. Then we need to set up the constructor of our class. If you want to create a new object, you use a class. In this case, we'll be using the plugin class. And well, to instantiate a class, you need a special function which is called a constructor. And in PHP, this is formatted like this. But because we are going to use the singleton pattern, this function will be private, meaning it cannot be called by anything outside of this class. Well, in our constructor, we'll do some things which I will explain later. Then this is the actually proof of eating the pudding, or actually interesting part. We're going to write our instance methods. And in the instance method, we are going to look if our instance is already there. And because this is a static property, as you can see here by the keyword static, we can access it by using self and then using instance. And here we check if this is not yet set. So if this is null, then we are going to create a new instance. And again, we can use new self. And what this actually does is that it executes the constructor, so the private function construct in here. Otherwise, if this already exists, we just return the existing instance. So if this will be the first time looking at this pattern, it may be a bit confusing, but basically what this does is that this piece of code only allows this plugin to be instanced once. And there we are. Alrighty, so now we should actually be able to call this plugin, and so this function should work. So if I go and reload this page, the error should be gone, and otherwise we did something wrong. Well, as you can see, the error is gone, and now I want to briefly explain what is happening here in our autoload register function. So if I dump the variable class name, we can see what is happening actually. So let's reload the front end, and well, I can see a couple of classes are called in here. That output is not really that clean. It's kind of dirty way to show you how it works, but as you can see here on the left, there's still a remnant of our plugin class in there. And actually you can see this class is also being called, and this is actually the class we are calling here in the code. So you can see all the classes that are called are ending up in here, and then the rest we did already explained. In this case, if the class doesn't contain our namespace, we'll return. Otherwise, we will format the class into the correct called class, and we will format it into a file. So in the end, we'll end up with this file, and if I check that out on the website itself, you will see we have this string, which is the correct string to the file. And let's go back to the code. Well, if this file exists, it is required. And in that way, anytime we call a class, such as we did here, it's automatically load. Awesome. But you're not here for the autoloading, you're here for components, and that's the next part we're going to create, and we were looking into the component class actually. And we'll start writing this file by starting with some opening text. So what we're now going to do is create an abstract class for our components, and this functions, it functions as a template for our other classes, which are real components, and actually have some properties and some methods that can be used by all components. So this may be a bit of abstract, but it will be clear in a moment. So again, we need to start with defining our namespace, and as you know, we use this as the main namespace, so we need to define it here, but we're now one folder deeper. So we also need to define or state that we're one folder deeper, and we're now actually the namespace myPHP_components, because we're here in the components folder actually. And this is actually how it is set up, how the rule is. You namespace according to your folders, and as you can see, the folder is also here capitalized, and again, all the class files are capitalized. This is a common practice. It's good if you set it up like this. Then again, we paste the rule that is needed for some additional security, and then we start writing our abstract class, and this will be an abstract class. And an abstract class is actually a class that cannot be instanced or initialized by itself, but it can be used by older classes, so in that way it forms some kind of template. We're going to have actually two properties, actually three properties that are going to be used by this class, which are the parameters, params, called, it will be a protected property, And this property is actually used by all the components for the input parameters we're going to use. It will be clear later. Then we're going to use a public property called props, and this will contain all the properties that are actually displayed in a template. And then at last, we're going to use the property template. And this will be empty in the beginning, and this will actually store our template. Now we will create a constructor, and in my setup, the constructor will not be able to be overridden. So this is a final function, so to say. It cannot be overridden. It accepts two arguments, the params, actually the parameters for this component. This will be an empty array by default, and whether we're going to format our parameters or not. And in this case, it will be true by default. Now, there is some type checking in PHP. So if you want to do this more nicely, you can define the expected type. In this case, this is an array. In this case, it's a Boolean. Well, no, I think it should be bool in PHP. What it does is if you don't use an array or don't use a Boolean here as an argument, it will throw up an error. And obviously, if you want to code properly, you also add comments, and it could be something like this. I'll just paste it in. We have the params, which are the parameters for a component, and then the format. Similarly, you can also comment each of these properties. That's what a good programmer does. He or she will add these comments to the code, so any other programmer knows what is happening. So we'll be calling 3 methods in this constructor function. We will be creating the first. We're going to create an abstract function register. This is a protected function, and again, you have seen these words in multiple places. Protected here, public, protected again, and here's protected. And what this means is that any child component, so a class can have any child class, so class can have a child, and I will explain it later. When we're going to create the example component, can have access to this function. If it would be private, only this class itself has access. And if it would be public, anything would have access. So child components, but also if you have instantiated the class, you can access this function. In this case, it needs to be inside the class only, so we make it protected. And this is an abstract function, meaning the function will be empty on itself, but it says that anything that is a child of this class, this component class, should have this function. And I will add some additional comments to it, so it's clear what it does. Then we have a second function. So this function is going to be used to format and set our parameters. And the second function we're going to use to format our parameters into properties. And these properties we're going to use in templates to be displayed. Maybe a bit complicated, but this will give a very clean flow of separating what you put into a component and what is finally accepted as output. So let's add a comment for this second function. Well, this function will be used for formatting or querying of data based on the parameters, and we'll just make it an abstract protected function as well, because this is also going to be used by any child of this component. And finally, we also want to display our components in the end. For that, we're going to use a render function, and this will be a public function. So it can also be used outside of classes. It won't, but we also make the final function, so it cannot be overwritten by any children. I will add a parameter which is called echo, and this states whether the template or the component we are displaying will be echoed or will be just returned as a string. And if you want to do this correctly, of course, we need to say that our parameter is here. So let's do first an if check. And so these are actually, oh no, I'm going back. So these are actually the functions of our abstract class. And now let's go back and start filling in our constructor. So the first thing we're going to do is to execute the register function by default. And then we're setting up the file. So what I'm going to do is that any component is called by calling a class, for example, in this case, example component, but this class will only contain the data, and all the output is called, is placed in the templates folder. So we need to make a link between this class and the templates folder. And in this case, all the files in the template folder will have the exact same name as the class name itself. And we can get actually the class name in various ways. And in this case, we are going to use an inbuilt class of PHP, which is the reflection class. And that will allow us to actually return the class name. So we're going to use this internal class. And as you can see, there's a backward slash. There's a backward slash in front of this class, and we need that because we're going to use namespaces, and otherwise an error would throw up. And well, we don't want that. And then we're going to call the method get short name. And well, what this does is not so complicated. It will return the actual file of the called class and then lowercase it. Strength to lower will lowercase it. And then our template will be quite simple. We're going to use the path we defined in here. So in this case, the NPC path, or yeah, let's make this name somewhat easier. I will just call it plugin path. Whoopsie. Let's copy this constant. Well, this is the path of our plugin. And then we only need to define the location of our template. And in this case, it will be actually in here. Well, let's also improve this a bit by adding a components folder, so we know that all the things in here are components. And then obviously our file. So our template is now set. The last thing we're going to do is that we want to set our parameters. We're going to do this by parsing the incoming parameters with the existing ones. And the existing ones we're going to set with the register function inside a component itself. Now we are actually almost done with the constructor. One other thing we want to do is that we wanted to execute the format function by default, and we can move on to the render function. So if you think about it, what should the render function actually do? Well, it should make all properties available to the template and also check if the template exists. So both these things should be actually exist for a render function to be successful. So we can add an if check for properties or the existence of a template. In this case, you know, we set the template property here before, and now we check if the file exists, and if it doesn't, we just return. What I like to do, it's depending on your preference, is that all of the properties are actually available under their own variable, and properties is set up as an array. So we can loop through them. And then all of these values in this array will be made available under the actual name. And later on, when we're going to create the example component, you actually will see what this does. Then there also was this parameter echo, which was true by default. But if it isn't true, we want to be able to return the string of the template. And there's a very smart way in PHP to do this, and that is using output buffering. And output buffering is a technology that actually captures anything that is outputted as a string. And so you can start that by using the ob_start function. Then we can echo or require or do anything we want as long as it has output. The output buffering will capture it. In this case, it's only enabled if you have echo set to false. And then at last, we can use the function ob_getClean to capture the output, and in this case we'll be returning that, and this will be a string. And there we are, we have actually the basis for our components, and we're now going to create our first example component in the file example component.php. So if you don't have this file already, go ahead and create it. I'll be just pasting a bit of this function and it will save some time. Because the namespace will be the same because we're in the same folder, and obviously our class needs to have a different name, like example component. And now becomes the interesting part, because we're now going to use our abstract component class. We can do that by using the keyword extend, and then component, and now all the methods available, all the methods defined in here are available to example component.php. And as you may already have seen, we have two abstract functions, register and format, and these need to be in this component. So we need to set it up, and it should be in a similar setup, so it should be also protected. And then we can actually find it, and then we also have the other one. Now you've been coding along and thinking, whoa, well, where I'm going to use these functions for? Well, the first function, register, in this component we're going to use to register default parameters, and the only thing we need to do is to set anything that is default in here. And we're going to create a very simple component. Let's make it a button component, really, so a component that is displaying some kind of button. So we need probably some text, and this will be empty by default. So in register, we register just our default parameters, and we also want to have a link in the button, and this will be a sharp by default. And maybe we also want to have one of the class, maybe we want to have a thing that we can use for the size of the button, and by default this is regular, for example. Well, what is happening in here is that we set our parameters, and then in the component class itself, in the constructor, it will execute register first, so these parameters are set, and then later on anything that is given as an input here as params will be part of the existing parameters, which are these ones. So in that way you can create new components, give them some parameters, and these will be merged with these default parameters. Then we also need to prepare our parameters to be displayed in our templates. And as you know, in the render function we're taking everything that's in props and setting it up as a variable. And because it's in this one function where we also require the template, these variables will also be available in this template. So what we need to do here is set our properties, And in this, this is a very simple component. If you would have a component that is querying posts based on certain arguments, this component would be a lot more elaborate. So in this simple example, we can just loop through our parameter, through our parameters, and set them as properties. And there we are. We're done in this. We are done. Now the last thing we need to do at the PHP side is to actually define our code, our component itself, our template. And here we're going to use plain old HTML, and we said this is going to be a button component, so I will be using the anchor tag, and then we'll be using an href. Maybe we can give the class and now it becomes interesting, because in component.php we casted all the properties to their own variables. We can now access them here. Just size, as you can see here, size. We loop through it. It's the same as this, only it's a variable, and our link then subsequently will be link, similar as this value. And our text will be, you guessed it, text. And let's echo it here. And obviously, if you want to make components more safe, you could do things such as ask HTML, which strips out any unwanted HTML. And there are a lot of other functions for escaping WordPress, and that will make your code more safe. Actually, it's not the scope of this video to do that, but it's a good practice. I will leave it as it is in here, using escape HTML function. This is a built-in function provided by WordPress. And now we're actually done. We've created our first component. So you may be wondering, how am I going to implement this component anywhere in WordPress? So let's write example function. In this case, I'll add a comment here, load our plugin, and this will be just output our example component. Use add filter in this case. You can use any WordPress hook, of course, or you can also use components inside your themes, the custom themes you're developing, and so forth. And I'm hooking into this filter, and this filter will have the content argument by default, and we also need to return it, otherwise there will be nothing in the content. This filter is actually executed on anything that's inside your posts or pages. Doesn't matter, anything that is a post or a page or a custom post type, and that is outputting content. So usually these are single files or singular files, is using this filter. So this is a very useful filter to add some additional stuff. And now we're going to create our first component, and we can do that by just calling our namespace and then using the namespace or components, and then the actual name of the component itself. In this case, it's example component. And as you know, we talked about parameters and default parameters, and these are merged. So in component.php, this is our first argument. So we can pass that in here. And in our component, we defined these three parameters. Obviously, you can pass anything else you want, because it will be parsed, but well, it won't work because it's not used in the template. Nevertheless, we can, for example, define text and set it to any text string, add a link, There we are. Now we have actually created a new instance of a component. Are we there yet? No, it won't display. We still need to render it. But it won't work if you do it like this, because it will actually output the component, but the filter here we use is actually used to return the content, and content is a string. So what we want to do is also return our component as a string. So let's just save it as a new variable and put echo to false. And then we can put it, for example, in front of content, or behind content. Let's just put this behind content. And well, now we added this component to our content. And if I go then to the front end, for example, this post, hello world, this should be added in here. So let's see if this works. And it doesn't work, so something goes wrong, and we're going to see what is wrong. Yeah, it's very simple. I forgot to use the new keyword. So there we are. As you can see, this text is now added to after the content. Obviously it's not formatted properly, as you can see, but here we are in entry content. This is just the default content of this post. And after this, we have our component button regular. Obviously we can also change the size if you would like to, for example, large. And then if you would reload this page, you can see this is also changed to button large. So you created your first component. How awesome is that? And probably you see this has a lot of power. You can create any component you want. This has been a very simple component, but if you know PHP, if you have created themes with PHP, you can see this will have a lot of power. You can create components that query posts, that create filters, that have a lot of stuff. You just need to be creative. So in the final part of this tutorial, I will just explain how you can add assets to this component. So assets are scripts and styles, so JavaScript, CSS. And in most cases, you want to have your components to be styled and also to add some interactivity to it. And for that, you need CSS and JavaScript. And for this, we also need Node, and we're going to initialize our first package. And for that, you need to open up your terminal at the location of your plugin, the plugin we are creating. In this case, it's already opened in here, and you need to execute npm init. And this will set up a new package.json file and open up a wizard. I will just give it this package name, version 1 is fine. Leave the description empty. Our entry point, yeah, it doesn't really matter. Let's take the config file. We don't have a test command. In this case, I linked this to GitHub. So this will be our repository, but you probably won't have it. Leave keywords author empty, and license is fine by default. And let's just click hit enter, and what this will do is create this package.json file, and in this file all your Node packages will be visible. Actually, let's change our main entry point to public, then to public scripts. Now in this project I'm going to use ESBuild as a bundler, and what a bundler is that it takes all your scripts and assets and bundles it in compiled files, which are usually all the files together, and they're usually smaller and can be understood by multiple browsers. But to use ESBuild, we need a couple of other packages which we can install using npm, and these are all dev dependencies. So you can use this command npm i-d to install them as development dependencies. And we're going to need auto prefixer, ESBuild itself, ESBuild, Sass plugin, and post CSS, which we'll all be using for bundling our assets. In the meantime, I will be adding a git ignore file, and this will say that we are going to ignore the node modules folder in which our modules are placed. Oops, I made a small typo, as you can see. Issue, of course, doesn't exist. So I need to redo the command. And now this should work. And there we are. There are a couple of modules added. As you can see, a lot of modules. But ESBuild is in here, and we can start building our assets. The focus of this tutorial is not on bundling scripts, so I will just be pasting the script that is needed. In short, what this does is that everything which is in assets, it will compile and bundle and put it in a folder called public. So if I run in my package.json, if I add a new script, for example, a bundle script, this script will use node, and then it will actually execute our ESBuild configuration, the file I pasted in here. If I will be running this script, npm run bundle, you will see it will be started up, and there the public folder is generated with our scripts and also our CSS, which I already set up here beforehand. In this case, I'm using TypeScript and Sass to do my styling. Obviously, you can set it up in any preference you want. The final thing we need to do is you need to enqueue them. So you can either do that in your example component in the formatting, or use the plugin class to enqueue them at once. The advantage of enqueuing them here is that they're only enqueued if this component is actually used, but you will have more files, and the advantage of here is that you can bundle them in one file and use it anyways. And you can of course do both options, or also enqueue file here in the component. And for doing that, for properly enqueuing them, we'll be adding a new function here to the plugin. Called enqueue script, and we'll be adding this method. And this function will actually enqueue our scripts. So we'll be hooking into the action. Enqueue scripts function. And we can use the WP enqueue style to enqueue our styles, and the enqueue scripts to enqueue our script. And let's call it component styles. Then we need to pass in the URL. Actually, we need to pass in the URL, and we didn't define the URL yet, so let's define that in our main plugin file. Next to where we define the path, we can just copy this one and say plugin URI. And then we're not going to use plugin dir path, but instead we're going to use what's the function called? Plugin dir URL. It's that easy. And there we are. We also have the URL, and we can use that to set up and also to link to our asset. So in this case, it will be public CSS, and then styles. And for the other one, you can just copy this and call it scripts and change this to scripts. And we don't have any dependencies. It doesn't have a version yet. And we want to output this in the footer. There we are. This will enqueue our scripts as well. So this is the basis you need for setting up reusable components. If you're new to classes in PHP, this may be really overwhelming. If you're already familiar with it, this may have given you a very interesting way to set up components. And I hope it will give you some inspiration to start creating your own components and extending your plugins and themes. I hope you liked building your first component, and you can also see what all the possibilities are of using components and extending these components and using them any place in your WordPress. And also you understand what it can be used for. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them below, and happy WordPressing!